Story 1. I have been in the police force for over 5 years, and all these years have taught me one thing: to rely on the facts and what is right in front of my eyes. But there's an incident from a month back that still got me thinking whether there are things beyond what our eyes can see or not. So it was one of those cold winter nights, the kind of quiet night that sends chills down your spine. But by then we were accustomed to the quiet and chilly streets, though it didn't necessarily mean we liked it. Officer Pierce and I were patrolling that night when dispatch came over the radio. A caller had reported loud, unsettling screams from an apartment above theirs. The address was only a few blocks away, so we turned on the sirens and headed over. We assumed it was another domestic violence case, as we had been getting a lot of those lately. When we reached the building, it looked like any other 4-story apartment block. Each floor had a narrow hallway, with a few doors leading to separate apartments, their numbers faded and uneven. Amongst it all, there was an eerie sense of quietness in the whole building, and even outside. But what else could we expect at 1:30 a.m. in the night? We finally entered and got to the apartment the caller had complained about. It was on the 4th floor, and the hallway was dead silent. No noise, no movement. The only sound we could catch was the wind howling outside from a cracked hallway window. I had heard nothing on my way up, and certainly couldn't hear any disturbance coming from the apartment. To be honest, I heard nothing at all. We knocked once, no answer. We tried again, but we heard nothing, not even a slight shuffle from inside. We waited for a good 2 minutes before Officer Pierce told me that he'd go downstairs and talk directly to the informant who had called 911 about the unsettling screams. Once Pierce left to go downstairs, I tried knocking on the door once again. This time, to my surprise, I heard faint movement from the inside. Nothing much, just little creaks and a soft scuffling, like someone shifting cautiously across the floor. And soon enough, the door opened, and an old man, probably in his 60s, appeared. I could not help but feel the temperature around me shift colder than it already was. The old man looked groggy, like he'd just been woken up from a deep sleep, and a bit confused to see me standing there past midnight. That's when I asked him if everything was fine, as we had received a complaint about screams coming from his apartment. His response shocked me as he told me that couldn't be possible since he lived alone and had been off to sleep for the last 4 hours. I believed him, but something about the way he said it, combined with the coldness in the air, made me uneasy. There was a heavy chill that seemed to envelop me as soon as the door opened, like the cold wasn't just from the night air. I knew I had to check the apartment just to soothe my mind, if nothing else. So I asked the old man if I could come inside and check for myself that no one was there. He invited me in. The 2-roomed flat was oddly dark and cold despite the thermostat blasting at full power. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, not just the air. The only light in the whole house was a dim bedside lamp in the bedroom. But other than the spooky vibe of the house, there was no other alarming thing. Just as I was about to make my way out of the house, I received a call. It was Pierce. The second I picked up, he asked me if I was okay. I was confused. I mean, what harm could a spooky house and an old man cause to me? I told him that everything was fine and there was no disturbance or noise whatsoever. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. Pierce told me that he was in the apartment below and he could also listen to the shrill screams and thuds coming from the ceiling. I froze. How was that even possible? I could still feel the coldness in the apartment, but it wasn't coming from the old man or anything inside. It felt like something else was there, something just out of sight, and just then I felt a quick movement behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up because the old man was sitting right in front of me, and there was no one else in the house. I turned around to see nothing but a blank, dark window, the blackness on the other side unsettlingly still. The wind had died down. I asked the old man whether he saw something or not, but the old man told me that he had trouble seeing in the dark. I was more spooked than I cared to admit. Was it just my imagination playing games with me after hearing Pierce tell me about the noises, or was someone or something actually there? We could never find out because soon enough Pierce called me to tell me that the screams had drowned out. I left shortly after apologizing to the elderly man for waking him so late at night. Pierce and I left the building, both of us shaken, though neither of us spoke much about it. We've never gotten another call from that apartment, and to this day, I still don't have a rational explanation for what happened. Story 2. 3 years ago, I was called to a burglary investigation at a local cemetery. It was a strange one. The call came in the early hours of the morning, and by the time I arrived, the sun hadn't even begun to rise. The forensics team and I weren't the first to get there, but the deputies hadn't entered the mausoleum yet. 4 patrol deputies and a sergeant stood outside, staring at the building as if it were the gates of hell itself. They didn't seem eager to go in, and I couldn't blame them. Something about the whole scene didn't feel right. I'd been on the force long enough to know when things were off, and this was one of those moments. I'd never seen them so hesitant. After a minute of standing around, they looked at us, just the forensics team, and nodded like we were the least dangerous of the bunch. Apparently, they felt safer letting us go in first, so we did. The mausoleum was an old one, the kind that's had more neglect than maintenance in the past few decades. The door had been forced open, and the lock was twisted and cracked. The metal door creaked in protest as we pushed it further open. The moment we stepped through the door, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just the cold from the morning air. It was something else, something I couldn't quite explain. Inside the mausoleum, dust coated every surface, and the air was thick, stale, almost like it hadn't been disturbed for decades. I glanced around, my boots scraping against the floor as I moved. The only sound was our footsteps. It was almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. After a few minutes of wandering around in the cold and the quiet, we found the damage. A gravesite had been completely disturbed. The cement plaque on the coffin was shattered. No, pulverized, like someone had used a hammer to smash it. The coffin itself had been dragged out of its alcove and tipped over, spilling whatever had been inside onto the cold floor. As we turned it back, what we saw made me freeze at my place. The coffin was empty. There was no body, no remains. But what really made it disturbing was that the cremated ashes of 3 people were gone. Gone. Not just stolen, but taken. The fact that the grave had been disturbed so violently struck me as deeply wrong. This couldn't have been done by a mere human without help. Because whoever had done this would have had to bring their own ladder, or been tall enough to reach at least 12 feet to remove the ashes. There was one living relative left for the deceased. I called the number I was given by the cemetery caretaker. A woman picked up, and I exchanged some pleasantries, letting her know that there had been an incident at the cemetery. When I mentioned the mausoleum, she went silent. There was a pause long enough to make me wonder if the line had dropped. Then in a heavy accent, she said, "No English," and the line went dead. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my neck, but it clung to me like a shadow. Nothing about this felt right. It wasn't just the absence of any leads, it was the way the place felt. The stillness, the emptiness. There was no sign anyone had been in the mausoleum for months, maybe years. No security cameras, no broken windows, no footprints. I left the mausoleum, but before I turned to go, I looked back. That's when I noticed something. The sky had changed. What had been a dark, overcast morning was now a sickly gray, with clouds that seemed to move unnaturally fast. The air felt thick, pressing down on me, almost suffocating. And then I heard it, a whisper. Not clear, not even a word, but enough to make the hairs on my neck stand up. I turned, heart racing, and that's when I saw it. The mausoleum door, slowly, creakingly, started to close. No one had been near it. I felt a cold knot in my stomach as I backed away quickly, catching up with Tom, who had already moved outside. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still in there, watching. We never found out what happened to the ashes or why the grave had been disturbed. A few days later, we got a report about another break-in at a different cemetery, but when we arrived, the place was locked up tight and there was no sign anyone had been inside. After that, the theft stopped. The cemetery went quiet. But the thing is, I still don't have an answer. I can't explain what I saw or what happened that night. Maybe it was just a burglary gone wrong. Maybe. But something about that mausoleum still nags at me. Something about that place isn't done yet. Story 3. I was an officer in a small town, the kind where nothing ever really happened. Most nights the station was quiet, the kind of place where you could hear the hum of the lights more than the radio chatter. But that night changed this perception of the town for me. It was late, way past midnight, when the call came in. A woman was terrified, claiming that a girl with red eyes was trying to get into her house. The dispatcher quickly relayed the details. She was alone with her baby, and the girl had been banging on the door after asking to be let inside. I was the closest officer available, so I was sent out alone. The rest of the crew was busy with a security detail at a nearby high-profile event. The house was only a few blocks away, but the drive there felt longer than it should have. The streets were dead quiet, and the air had an unnatural chill. When I arrived, I knocked on the door, which opened slowly to reveal a woman with wide, fearful eyes. She looked shaken, like she hadn't slept in hours. She quickly pulled me inside. She explained that the girl had knocked on the door and asked to be let in, and when the woman refused, she began slamming against the door with an intensity that terrified her. She said the girl's eyes were glowing red, like nothing she'd ever seen before. The woman had a baby in her arms, clinging to her as if it sensed the same fear. Naturally, I checked the house, every room, the windows, the back door. Nothing. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. There were no signs of anyone breaking in. The coldness of the air was unsettling, but the thermostat was set high, and the house was still freezing. I tried to reassure her, telling her that there was no one there and that she was safe. After a quick walk around the outside of the house, I got back in my car to head back to the station. The streets were still quiet, but something about the whole situation lingered in my mind, an unease that wouldn't go away. As I passed the small playground just a few blocks away, I saw her, a girl standing outside the swings, completely still. She wasn't moving, just staring down the empty street. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I slowed the car, I saw her, standing there like a shadow. But still, I couldn't be too sure. I stopped the car and got out, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. I approached the playground, scanning the area for any sign of the girl. But as I reached the swings, there was no one there. No footprints, no movement, nothing. I looked around, my heart beginning to race. The street was empty. Still, I felt an odd sensation, like I was being watched, but there was no one around, no one but me. I walked back to the car quickly, a strange weight pressing on my chest. I couldn't explain what had happened. Was it my mind playing tricks on me, or had I witnessed something real? Something that wasn't meant to be? I still don't know, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stop thinking about that girl, even when I made it to the station. Even now. Story 4. I've been a 911 dispatcher for nearly a decade, and in all those years I've handled my share of emergencies. Most of them are routine, a lot of false alarms, some tragic, but nothing really strange until one night a call came through that I've never been able to explain. It was a quiet shift, too quiet. The town was small, and things didn't usually happen after dark, especially not in the remote areas. I was just finishing up a couple of reports when the phone rang. I answered, expecting a standard request, but what came through was nothing like I had experienced before. The call was faint and crackling with static. There was only the sound of shaky breathing on the other end. I could barely make out the voice. It was an elderly woman, and she sounded like she was struggling to breathe. The panic in her breath was clear, and even though I couldn't understand her completely, I could tell she was in distress. I instructed the caller to stay calm and tried to gather her information, but the connection was so poor that all I could hear were gasps for air and static. It was difficult to make sense of anything. I tried to keep her on the line, hoping she could give me more details, but the call cut out abruptly. The address I had received was from a remote part of the county, a long way from town. I quickly dispatched paramedics and 2 police officers to the location, providing them with the address. I stayed on high alert, hoping the woman was still alive and that help would reach her in time. It wasn't long before I got an update from the paramedics, but it wasn't what I expected. They were at the location, but no one was answering the door. They confirmed the address, asking if I was sure it was correct. I was certain, but the lack of response from the house was unsettling. I instructed them to force entry, With permission granted, they broke the door down and entered the house. What they found inside shocked them and me to the core. The elderly woman, who had sounded so desperate on the phone, was already dead, her body showing all the signs of decomposition. She had been dead for at least 2 days, far longer than when the call came through. The paramedics were stunned. There was no way she could have been alive when the call was made. No way she could have been breathing that heavily or panicking. When the officers confirmed the details, I couldn't make sense of it. The woman had been dead for days, yet she had called for help. How was that possible? I had no explanation. I immediately went back to the records, pulling up the call logs to review what had happened. I listened to the call again, but all I could hear was static. There was no voice of the elderly woman or her struggled breathing. It was all static. I couldn't even trace where the call had come from. It was as though it had originated from nowhere, with no indication of the caller's location or how the connection had been made. I spent hours that night combing through the data, talking to the paramedics, and asking the officers if they had noticed anything unusual at the scene. No one could provide any answers. The house was in perfect order, except for the body, and there were no signs of any foul play or disturbances. The woman had simply been alone. I couldn't understand it, and no one else could either. To this day, I don't know what happened, and I still can't explain the call, the static, or the fact that it came from nowhere. I just know that sometimes, when you hear something you can't explain, you can't forget it. Story 5. I've been a cop long enough to think I've seen it all. Things I'd rather not remember, ugly fights, shattered families, the worst people can do to each other. But nothing like that night. The call came around 10 p.m. A family had reported their neighbor, a woman who lived alone, shouting and causing a disturbance. According to them, this wasn't the first time, though it had never been this bad. I arrived with my partner, and the house was just like any other on the block, plain and unassuming. The family looked understandably shaken, each of them glancing anxiously toward the neighboring property. They said the woman had been yelling at them for hours, screaming about curses and revenge. It had gotten so intense they'd called us, worried for their own safety. After talking with them, we headed over to the neighbor's house. There were no lights on inside, but her car was in the driveway. We knocked a few times and called out, but there was no response. We waited a while, hoping she'd come to the door or at least yell through a window. Nothing, not a sound. Finally, after trying for several minutes, we decided to go in. There was something about the silence that felt wrong. With the family's account of her earlier outburst, it was better to be cautious. Once we forced open the door, I immediately felt a chill, not the kind from a broken heater, but something that seeped in and lingered, heavy and unsettling. The air inside was stale and heavy, as if the windows hadn't been opened in months. But what I saw inside shook me to my very core. The first thing I noticed was the living room, dimly lit by a single lamp left on in the corner. There, hanging from the ceiling, were dozens of dolls, each one suspended by a string, swaying slightly as we walked through. They weren't regular dolls either. These were old, worn, and unsettling. Some had strange markings etched into their plastic skin, like symbols or letters. Others looked as though they'd been crudely torn, their limbs hanging on by threads. But the strangest thing was how human they seemed. Each doll had an eerie resemblance to real people. They weren't identical, but close enough that you could see the resemblance in their features, like little caricatures with haunted expressions. And then, just there on the coffee table, I noticed 3 new dolls, placed neatly in a row. These ones looked fresh, not covered in dust like the others, but they looked familiar. Too familiar. It hit me then. These dolls looked exactly like the family who'd called us. I recognized the father's furrowed brow, the mother's narrow eyes, and even the child's expression, strangely distorted on the tiny plastic face. Each one was dressed in crude miniature versions of the clothes they'd been wearing when we arrived. I felt a creeping dread as we moved deeper into the house. Room after room was empty, abandoned, but filled with more dolls, some hung from doorways or piled in corners, all arranged like a twisted shrine. We searched every inch of that house, but there was no sign of the woman who lived there. Her belongings were untouched, Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, and her keys dangled from a hook by the door. It didn't make any sense. Her car was still in the driveway, yet she was gone, vanished without a trace. The next step was to check the building's CCTV. Luckily, the neighborhood had security cameras facing the street and entryways, so we were able to review the footage. What we saw was disturbing, but not in the way I'd expected. The last time she was seen was that evening, around 5 p.m., in a heated exchange with the family. She looked furious, her mouth moving in what seemed like a string of curses as the family tried to ignore her. Then she'd stormed back into her house, and that was it. After that, there was no movement, no one coming or going from the property. It was as though she'd stepped inside and just disappeared. We looked through hours of footage, every angle we could, but there was nothing, no sign of her. Eventually, we had to close up the scene and file a report on the unusual incident, but it didn't feel right. It felt like leaving something unfinished. To this day, no one has seen or heard from her. No one claimed her belongings, no family members came looking. It was as though she'd never existed, aside from the memories of her neighbors and the unsettling dolls she left behind. The family moved a few months later, said they couldn't stand living next door to an empty house that had once held something they didn't want to remember. Every so often, I drive past that street, and the sight of her house still gives me a shiver. I don't know what we walked into that night or where she went. All I know is that I can still see those dolls, staring down at us from their strings, lifeless but somehow watching, as though they knew something we didn't. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.